In the winter of 1940, in a city called Harbin, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a man arrived for work. He put on his white coat. He walked through a series of locked doors. He entered a room where a prisoner, a Chinese civilian, captured weeks earlier, was strapped to a table. The man was a doctor. His name was Shiro Ishii. He held the rank of lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was also, by any rational standard, one of the most prolific mass murderers in the history of modern medicine. What happened in that room, and in thousands of rooms like it, over 9 years, in a complex that covered 6 square kilometers in the frozen plains of Manchuria, was not hidden, not exactly. It was classified, buried, protected by a decision made in Washington in 1945 that would not be fully understood for another 40 years. The facility was called, officially, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Inside, it was something else entirely. Unit 731 was the largest biological warfare research program ever conducted. It employed more than 3,000 scientists, doctors, and technicians at its peak. It occupied a complex of more than 150 buildings. It had its own railway line, its own power plant, its own airfield. It produced biological weapons on an industrial scale. 300 kilograms of plague bacteria per month, 500 kilograms of anthrax, 800 kilograms of typhoid, 1,000 kilograms of cholera, and it used human beings as its test subjects. The prisoners came from across occupied China, Chinese civilians, Russian nationals, Korean laborers, Mongolian prisoners of war, and, this detail appears in declassified American documents, at least some captured American soldiers. Inside Unit 731, they were not called prisoners. They were not called patients. They were not called human beings. They were called maruta, logs, wooden logs. That was the language the doctors used. Because logs are raw material, logs are processed, logs do not have names or families or histories. Logs are used and then discarded. Approximately 3,000 people died inside Unit 731 as direct victims of the experiments. Hundreds of thousands more died in field tests. When Unit 731 aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities and watched the outbreak spread through the civilian population. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Shiro Ishii gave an order: destroy everything. The buildings were demolished. The records were burned. The remaining 400 prisoners, the ones still alive in the cells when the war ended, were executed. The staff were ordered to swear an oath of secrecy under penalty of death. Then Ishii went to find the Americans. He brought his research data, thousands of pages, the clinical records of every experiment, the progression of plague through a human body at each stage of infection, the effects of frostbite at specific temperatures over specific durations, the lethal doses of anthrax, cholera, typhoid, data that could only have been gathered one way, by infecting living human beings and recording what happened to them. General Douglas MacArthur received the offer. He consulted Washington. President Truman approved. The deal was made. In 1946, in Nuremberg, Germany, 23 German doctors were tried for crimes against humanity. 16 were convicted. 7 were executed. The Nuremberg doctors' trial established the foundation of modern medical ethics. It produced the Nuremberg Code, the principle that no human being may be subjected to medical experimentation without their free and informed consent. The men who ran Unit 731 were not at Nuremberg. They were at home, in Japan. Some of them were already back at work, at universities, at hospitals, at pharmaceutical companies. Some of them would go on to distinguished careers in Japanese medicine. Some of them would receive government honors. Shiro Ishii would die in his bed of throat cancer in 1959. He never spent a single day in prison. This is the story of Unit 731, and the story of the deal that made all of it possible. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in a small village in Chiba Prefecture. He was brilliant, ambitious, and obsessed from an early age with the potential of biological warfare. His argument, which he made repeatedly and persuasively to his superiors in the Japanese military throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, was simple. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 had banned the use of biological and chemical weapons in warfare. And if the world's powers had banned something, Ishii argued, it must be because they knew it worked. Japan should develop these weapons. Japan should be ready to use them. And Japan should know exactly what they could do to a human body, which meant testing them on human bodies. His superiors agreed. In 1936, Emperor Hirohito personally authorized the establishment of Unit 731. The facility was built in Harbin, far enough from Japan that the experiments could be conducted without attracting domestic attention, and in occupied territory where the supply of prisoners was effectively limitless. Ishii recruited the best medical minds Japan had to offer. Doctors from Tokyo Imperial University, researchers from Kyoto, specialists in bacteriology, virology, surgery, frostbite, pressure physiology. He promised them unlimited resources and the freedom to conduct research that was, as he put it, ethically impossible in peacetime. They came. Inside Unit 731, the work was organized with bureaucratic precision. Division 1 was responsible for bacteriological research, growing and studying plague, typhoid, anthrax, and cholera. Division 2 developed methods of deploying biological agents in the field. Other divisions handled production, storage, clinical diagnosis, and the training of field units. The human experiments were conducted across multiple departments. Prisoners were infected with pathogens and observed as the diseases progressed. They were not treated, they were observed. Every stage of the illness was documented: the development of symptoms, the deterioration of organs, the timing of death. The bodies were autopsied immediately after death to record the internal damage. Some experiments had no biological warfare application whatsoever. Prisoners were placed in pressure chambers to study the effects of extreme atmospheric pressure on the human body. Ishii wanted to know at what point the eyes would be forced from their sockets. This data was recorded. It was published, after the war, in Japanese medical journals, without any disclosure of how it had been obtained. Prisoners were subjected to sustained frostbite experiments in the Manchurian winter. Their limbs were frozen and then thawed repeatedly to document the progression of tissue destruction. Limbs that became gangrenous were amputated without anesthesia. The experiment then continued on the remaining limbs. The frostbite experiments were personally overseen by a Unit 731 researcher named Shiro Kasahara. After the war, Kasahara returned to Japan and became a respected virologist. He died in 1991. He was never prosecuted. The vivisection experiments were among the most systematically documented. Prisoners were infected with specific pathogens and then, at predetermined points in the disease's progression, surgically opened while still alive, without anesthesia, so that the doctors could observe the internal effects of the disease on living tissue. The absence of anesthesia was deliberate. Anesthesia, the researchers had determined, altered the body chemistry in ways that compromised the data. The data was considered excellent. It was this data, the clinical records of what specific diseases did to specific human bodies at specific stages of infection, that Shiro Ishii would eventually offer to the United States government in exchange for his freedom. Unit 731 was not only a laboratory, it was also an operational military unit. Beginning in 1940, Ishii's team began conducting what they called field tests, deploying biological weapons against Chinese civilian and military populations to evaluate their effectiveness under real-world conditions. The primary delivery method was the ceramic bomb. Unlike metal bombs, ceramic casings did not generate the heat of a metal explosion that would kill the biological agents inside. A ceramic bomb filled with plague-infected fleas would shatter on impact, releasing thousands of infected fleas into a populated area. The results were precisely documented. In October 1940, Unit 731 aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over the city of Kuzhou in Zhejiang province. An outbreak of bubonic plague followed. The progression of the outbreak was monitored by Unit 731 teams on the ground. Similar attacks were conducted over at least 11 Chinese cities and towns between 1940 and 1942. The total death toll from Unit 731's field operations is impossible to determine with precision. The records were burned. The Japanese government denied for decades that any of it had happened. Current estimates, based on the evidence that has survived, place the number of civilian deaths from Unit 731's field operations at between 200,000 and 500,000 people. Not prisoners in a laboratory, civilians, people who lived in cities, who had no idea what was falling from the sky above them, who died of plague and cholera and anthrax and attributed it to the natural catastrophes that war brings, not knowing that the catastrophe had been manufactured in a laboratory 6 square kilometers wide in Harbin. When Japanese forces retreated from a region, they contaminated the water supplies. They released plague-infected rats. They left behind biological traps designed to continue killing after the army had moved on. Unit 731 estimated that its monthly production capacity included 300 kilograms of plague, 500 to 700 kilograms of anthrax, 800 to 900 kilograms of typhoid, and 1,000 kilograms of cholera. This was not a fringe operation. This was Japanese military policy, authorized at the highest levels, funded by the imperial government, approved by the emperor. In the fall of 1945, a United States Army officer named Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders arrived in Japan. Sanders was a bacteriologist. He had been sent to Japan specifically to investigate Japanese biological warfare research. What he found disturbed him profoundly, but it also excited the American military establishment in a way that would shape the outcome of everything that followed. Japan was years ahead of the United States in biological warfare research. Decades, in some areas. The data that Ishii's team had accumulated on the effects of specific pathogens on human bodies at specific doses under specific conditions was data that American researchers at Fort Detrick could not have produced, because American law and American ethics prohibited experimenting on human beings without consent. Ishii's data had no such constraints. Sanders reported his findings to General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur reported to Washington. The recommendation was clear. Grant immunity to Ishii and his key researchers in exchange for full access to all data, all documentation, and personal briefings from the scientists themselves. The decision was made at the highest levels of the American government. A declassified 1947 memorandum, signed by American occupation authorities in Japan, stated explicitly that the value of the Unit 731 data was deemed to outweigh the cost of granting immunity to the perpetrators. The memo noted that the data represented, in its words, a 50-year advantage in biological warfare research. 50 years. That was the calculation. The lives of 3,000 prisoners, hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. The principle that crimes against humanity should be prosecuted. Against 50 years of biological warfare research data. The American government chose the data. Shiro Ishii handed over thousands of pages of clinical records. He gave personal briefings to American researchers. He walked them through the methodology, the dosing, the progression of symptoms, the autopsy findings. He was cooperative and thorough. In return, he received immunity from prosecution. So did his key researchers. So did the doctors who had performed the vivisections. So did the officers who had managed the field operations. The Soviet Union did not make the same deal. In December 1949, the Soviet government held the Khabarovsk war crimes trial, prosecuting 12 Japanese officers and scientists from Unit 731 and affiliated biological warfare units. Sentences ranged from 2 to 25 years. The United States dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as Soviet propaganda. American media barely covered them. The convictions were not recognized by the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which had been told nothing about Unit 731 by American authorities. The judge who presided over part of the Tokyo Tribunal, a Dutch jurist named Bert Roling, later wrote about learning, decades after the fact, that evidence of Unit 731's activities had been deliberately withheld from the court by the United States government. He wrote, "It is a bitter experience for me to be informed now that centrally ordered Japanese war criminality of the most disgusting kind was kept secret from the court by the United States." A judge, who had presided over the most significant war crimes tribunal in Asian history, who had not been told, because the United States had decided that the data was more valuable than the trial. Shiro Ishii died on October 9, 1959. He was 67 years old. He died of throat cancer at his home in Tokyo. He had spent the 14 years since the war living quietly, giving occasional briefings to American researchers when requested, and, by multiple accounts, drinking heavily. He was never arrested, never charged, never tried. The doctors who worked under him returned to civilian life. Some became professors at major Japanese universities. Some became hospital directors. Some went to work for pharmaceutical companies, companies that are still operating today. Several received government honors in the decades after the war. A researcher named Masaji Kitano, who had commanded Unit 731 after Ishii, became the head of a major blood banking organization in Japan after the war. He remained in that position for years. He gave interviews, he published papers, he attended conferences. None of them were prosecuted in Japan, not one. It was not until 1984, nearly 40 years after the war ended, that Japan officially acknowledged that Unit 731 had conducted human experimentation. In 2002, a Tokyo district court ruled for the first time that Japan had engaged in biological warfare in China. The court accepted the evidence. It acknowledged the deaths. And then it ruled that the victims had no legal claim for compensation because the state could not be held liable for wartime actions. No reparations were paid. No specific apology was issued. No prime minister has ever directly addressed Unit 731 by name in a formal apology. The United States government has never acknowledged the immunity deal publicly. It has never apologized to the victims of Unit 731's field operations. The data gathered from those experiments was incorporated into the American biological warfare program at Fort Detrick and used for decades. The Nuremberg Code, the principle that emerged from the trial of Nazi doctors, the principle that no human being may be subjected to medical experimentation without consent, was established in 1947. The same year the immunity deal for Unit 731 was formalized. The United States helped write the Nuremberg Code, and then in the same year made a deal that violated everything it stood for. The names of most of Unit 731's victims are not known. The records were burned. The prisoners were referred to in the surviving documents by numbers, not names. The Chinese civilians who died in the field operations were never individually identified. The American soldiers who may have been used as subjects, their existence appears in declassified documents but has never been officially confirmed, were never named. 3,000 people died inside the facility. Hundreds of thousands died in the field. They have no individual memorial, no list of names carved into stone, no Nuremberg to mark the accounting of what was done to them. The men who killed them received immunity, received careers, received honors. There is a pattern in every story this channel has told. MK Ultra, Operation Midnight Climax, Tuskegee, Operation Paperclip, Unit 731. In every case, the same logic appears, the same calculation. The science, or the technology, or the intelligence advantage was worth more than the accountability. The data was worth more than the trial. The strategic benefit was worth more than the victims. And in every case, the decision was made by people who believed with apparent sincerity that they were doing what was necessary, that the stakes were high enough, that the alternative, Soviet biological weapon superiority or Soviet rocket technology, or losing the Cold War, was worse than the compromise they were making. Maybe they were right about the stakes. The Cold War was real. The Soviet threat was real. The biological weapons race was real. But the people who paid the price of those calculations were not the people making them. They were the prisoners in the cells, the farmers in the Chinese villages, the sharecroppers in Alabama, the strangers in the San Francisco bars. They were never asked, "If this story matters to you, share it." Because most people who know about the Holocaust have never heard of Unit 731. Most people who know about Nazi medical experiments have never heard that the doctors who did something equivalent in Manchuria walked free, with American protection. Now you know. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. See you next time.